Welcome to Faith Vocals. My name is Faith. Getting back to a normal routine. It's been a while. I had a few weeks where I had a cold. I still feel like I've got a little bit of recovery to do, but I don't expect it to get in the way of the video today. And then last week was was Good Friday, right before Easter Sunday, and I hope you had a great Easter. So I took a break from the usual line that we've been doing, the usual schedule, and I think that the content that I had last week was really special. Check the Good Friday stream, the one just before this one. Not a stream. I'm doing videos these days, but stream style. So I stumble over myself more and deviate more, and probably need to work on my presentation. But at least last week's stream I think was great, a bit longer. But if you're interested in who Jesus thought he was, what Jesus said about himself, who Jesus thought he was, then I'd encourage you to go back and check on that stream. I was looking at his words in the Bible, particularly in the book of John, but I did head to some other locations, at least initially, during the stream. And today we get back to the normal line that I've been doing on these streams. I want to talk about truth, about beliefs. I'd love to hear about your beliefs. Please leave your comments downstairs and let me know what you believe and why you believe it. I present my beliefs being a Christian. If you didn't pick that up from me talking about Jesus and the Bible, I've been going through the book of Genesis. So that's what we're going to resume doing. We're going to have a look at Jacob's two wives, which should be interesting because in my culture here in the United States, we do not endorse polygamy. Mostly, I think it's becoming one of those things that's more popular for people who are not Christians to talk about. Most Christians, I believe, hold to a biblical standard, and someone might say, well, what do you mean by biblical standard? You just said we're going to be talking about Jacob's two wives. Aren't Christians monogamous? And yes, we are. And if we look at the Bible, I believe we can see evidence that God actually prefers monogamous relationships, marriage between one man and one woman. I believe that's how it's supposed to be done. There is law in the Jewish scriptures regarding the concept of divorce. And that became an issue when Jesus was alive. Jesus was speaking to the teachers of the law, and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, why did Moses give us laws about how to be divorced? If that's not a good thing, you've been saying that it's not good for a man to be divorced from his wife, and yet Moses gave us that in the law. And Jesus said, Moses gave you that law because of the hardness of your hearts. Of course, speaking back to the people in Moses's time, the people in Moses's day had hard hearts, and that's what allowed laws like divorce to be a part of the Bible. I was speaking to a friend about something related to today's topic. I was asking their opinion on why is it that the Bible has these stories, like with Jacob and his two wives, and why there are laws in the Bible about how Israelites were to manage their multi-wife families, since God also says in the same laws a king should not be multiplying wives. So it seems like in the case of a king, at least, multiple wives is not a good thing. The more is not the merrier. And in the case later on in the New Testament, when God is telling churches through Paul how they were to establish leadership in those churches, how were they to find proper pastors and overseers. Some versions call them bishops. Leaders, often the churches that I've been part of will have like a pastor at the upper level, and then there may be a level underneath of elders or deacons. I was in one church that had the pastor and then the elders and then the deacons under that. So if you want to look at what those roles are, then I would suggest looking at the book of Acts. Early in the book of Acts, there's an account of where the deacons got started, why churches have deacons in them. So that comes, I think, probably around Acts 4, but you may want to look around in that neighborhood if you don't see it right in Acts 4. And then in the book of Titus, and in one of the Timothys, I believe, is where Paul gives instructions. Paul gives instructions to both of these individuals, Titus and Timothy, on how they're to establish the leadership in the churches where they're going to be working. And in the case of finding a pastor, God says the pastor must be a man of one wife. So it's clear that God is looking for people to be, that's better, at least as far as we can tell from God's preference for kings, God's preference for pastors. These are the pinnacles of leadership among humanity, and they're the examples that the people under them are looking to. A lot of the time, the king sets the fashion. A lot of the time, the pastor establishes the standard of behavior in the church. Of course, according to the Bible, doing their best to be right according to the Bible, but often where there's gray areas, then a pastor's going to arbitrate. It's going to say, well, let's be careful and lean in this way, or, well, I think that's all right as long as it's not in violation of what Scripture actually says. And then the church tends to run according to that arbitration. So the examples that God is setting for the rest of humanity, at least in the case of the nation of Israel and in the Christian church, the example is to be a man of one wife. That seems to be the standard that we are all to attain to. And I think this passage that we're going to look at gives us another good reason or so to see why it doesn't really work well, why polygamy doesn't really work well, why you don't want to have multiple wives in a household. So I'm probably speaking to the choir in this case. I'm not a pastor, so I'm not going to say I'm preaching to the choir. Most of you viewing will probably be okay with monogamous marriage relations. So this passage will be interesting since it's coming from a different cultural viewpoint. And that's, I actually find this kind of thing, looking at different cultures, looking at why it is that people behave in different ways and what the outcomes of those behaviors, I find that very interesting, which is very much why I want to have a conversation with you about why we may differ in our beliefs, why I choose to be a Christian, why you choose to be whatever you are. I definitely want to hear from you in the comments downstairs. So we'll get into the passage, but I want to get a running start with some context here for anyone who hasn't been on the channel before. Maybe you're not so familiar with this account. Maybe you haven't seen the streams from a few weeks ago. Not streams. I used to be doing streams. Videos from a few weeks ago where I was talking about the lead up to this account. So let's get some context and getting a running start first. As I mentioned, this is about Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. We spent a good while talking about Abraham in these videos. And then we spent a little while talking about Abraham's son, Isaac. And Isaac had two sons who were twins, Jacob and Esau was the older son. But God promised Isaac's wife, Rebekah, that the younger son would rule the older. And as it turned out, over the course of Jacob's life, he was able to bargain with Esau over Esau's birthright. That was the right of the firstborn child to have double the inheritance of the other children in the household. And actually, I was listening. I try to listen to a little bit of the Bible every day. And I came across a passage where God seems to be mandating that the birthright should be practiced in Israel in the law. It's not just something silly that people from ancient culture came up with before the law was established, but it seems to be something that God cares about in the law Israel. So I found that was interesting. But Esau, being a hunter, he had gone out to hunt food and had come back empty-handed and exhausted, pretty close to starving. And so Jacob was able to get him to trade his birthright in return for some stew that Jacob was cooking. And then later on, Isaac grew old. He lost his eyesight as a part of growing old. And so Jacob and Rebekah worked together to kind of prey on that when Isaac was about to give a blessing, a fatherly blessing, his last words essentially to Esau. Of course, he lived for a little while after that, but this was, he was of an age where he didn't know when he would die, so this was kind of putting his affairs in order. He was going to give Esau this fatherly blessing, and Jacob was able to usurp Esau's place, fool Isaac into thinking that Jacob was Esau, and so Isaac gave Esau's blessing to Jacob. And interestingly, that blessing included that the son to whom he was speaking would rule over the other son. So I don't know if Rebekah ever told him about that prophecy, because if he had given that blessing to Esau, that would have run completely contrary to the prophecy. But clearly, it was Jacob who received that blessing, and so prophecy is still on. God's word still stands true. Unfortunately, Jacob got into that position by deceiving his father Isaac, which I don't think was good. I don't think that God would have preferred that. I think God did know that that deception was going to happen. And so it did come to pass that Jacob is now, with his father's blessing, unrightfully stolen, and the birthright that he was able to get Esau to trade with him, now basically had the right and the rule of the firstborn child. Esau was not happy with that. Esau was fit to kill his brother Jacob, literally. And so Rebekah worked it out that Jacob could flee to her brother Laban's house, Jacob's uncle Laban. So Jacob left. As far as I know, he probably didn't see his parents ever again after that. And the deal, his mother was telling him, his parents were telling it, because his mother was also part of the deception, right? So she told Isaac, listen, I just don't want Jacob to marry any of the gals around here. The gals around here are dumb. I mean, not dumb. They're not my people. They don't share my values. I want him to marry good gals. So we're going to send him back to my family to find gals. And so they said, yes, go and find Laban and marry one of his daughters. And so Jacob gets to his uncle Laban's home in the city of Haran, and he takes a liking to Laban's youngest daughter, Rachel. I get Rebecca and Rachel mixed up often. So from now on, I'll be talking about Rachel, I believe. And so he fell in love with Rachel. Laban had him under his roof for a while, and then Laban said, listen, you've been working for me for a while. I ought to at least pay you something for the work that you're doing while you're under my roof. How about we make a deal, and you tell me what your wages will be, and you get to work here for 7 years. And Jacob said, well, I think your daughter Rachel is pretty nice. I would like to marry Rachel. And Laban says, okay, that's great. That's what we're going to do. You'll work for me for 7 years, and at the end of the 7 years, you get to marry my daughter Rachel. And then, as it turns out, on the day of the wedding, I guess the bride was veiled, as is commonly done in that culture. And Jacob got married and had his wedding night. And when he woke up, he realized he had his wedding night with Rachel's older sister, Leah, who he had not taken a liking to. She had weak eyes, so maybe that was a point against her in his sight. But he had not seen well enough to identify who it was that he married. Laban had pulled a switcheroo where it was Leah at the altar, or whatever their culture had, and Leah who had that marriage with him. So naturally, Jacob was upset, wanted an answer, and Laban's answer was, well, in our culture, we don't marry the youngest off first, so I had to give you the older sister. which the last time I was talking about this a few weeks ago, I thought was pretty disingenuous. It would have been nice if Laban had spoken about this before when they had first made the deal, that just so you know, if we can't just marry the younger one off, so be aware that that's a risk. That had never come up to this point. In talking to my friends about this, I guess we can be kind of charitable to Laban. One of them suggested maybe he hoped that Leah would be married off somewhere in that 7-year period and the issue would not come up. But Laban never brought the issue up. Even when it was time to marry, he thought it was better to just slide Leah in there in Rachel's place. And I don't know what the girls thought of this. I think we'll figure out a little bit of how Leah felt about this. But Jacob was there to marry Rachel, and so he was naturally upset about this. And Laban said, tell you what, how about you finish the week with this wife? I don't know what the week was. I do know in the book of Daniel, weeks are very important in the prophecy in the book of Daniel, except in that book, we're not talking weeks of 7 days. We're talking weeks of 7 years. And so I don't know if he's saying finish up the 7 years that we've got. We're not too far from the end of the 7 years. And at the end of that, you can marry Rachel. Or if he was saying that there's a cultural week regarding the wedding. So maybe if you have any more knowledge than I do about this, I'd definitely love to hear from you downstairs in the comments. So Laban's saying, tell you what, you finish up this period of time with this wife, and I'll give you Rachel for another 7 years. And Jacob loved Rachel so much, he just couldn't pass up this offer. Laban kind of had all the cards here. And so Jacob agreed to that 7 years. So now I think we can pull up the Bible passage. Now I think we're about caught up. Here we see Laban's words, complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me for another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. When Laban gave Leah to be Jacob's wife, when he pulled that switcheroo, he also gave the daughter that he was marrying off to Jacob a handmaid, which is going to be important here. Leah's handmaid was named Zilpah. Female servant in this version. I tend to look at these in the King James version when I'm studying, so handmaid is the word that comes up often in that. Jacob did so and completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah and served Laban for another 7 years. So what I'm seeing is Jacob works 7 years. Then Laban pulls the switcheroo and Jacob gets Leah. And then he wraps up whatever time, whether there was a specific 7-day period regarding the wedding or whether it was, they're using the word week in reference to the 7 years, finishing up those 7 years. And then Laban gives Jacob Rachel, knowing that Jacob will now work 7 more years in fulfillment of that promise in order to receive Rachel. And also, there's these 2 handmaids. I'll go ahead and preface by saying apparently there was something about the culture. I don't know if it's specifically about the people of Haran. I believe Haran was established by Abraham's father, Terah. Abraham was a brother to Nahor and to Haran. He had a brother named Haran who died. He passed away, and then Terah left where they originally lived, and I believe was heading toward Canaan, based on what it looks like when I'm reading the passage in Genesis about that, but didn't make it all the way to Canaan. He stopped in the middle and stopped at a city named Haran. Interesting that the city is named after his son. Maybe it was Terah who established the city and named it after his son. So I think that's what happened. And Nahor wound up living in Haran. Abraham moved on to Canaan because God told him to leave his family and move on to Canaan. And then later on, when Abraham needed a wife for his son Isaac, he sent his servant back to Haran to Nahor's house. Nahor had a son named Bethuel, and Bethuel had a son, Laban, and his daughter, Rebekah. And Rebekah's the one who married Isaac. And now as Jacob is running away from Esau, he is heading back to Haran and meeting with Rebekah's brother, Laban, and meeting his two daughters, Leah and Rachel. And marrying Leah and Rachel, apparently. And one thing about that we see in this period of the Bible, we saw it with Abraham and Sarah. Sarah was barren for the majority of her life until she was about 90 years old. And I'm double checking my math. I believe so. 90 years old. And when she turned 90, she had a son, Isaac. But Abraham, by the way, Abraham was not originally his name. As you know, if you've been going through the series, it originally was Abram. Her name was originally Sarai. And Abram means, I believe it means exalted father. So I don't want to chase rabbit trails, but later on God changed Abram's name to Abraham. If I'm not mistaken, that means father of nations. So feel free to check me on that. You can tell you what, I do want to see if I can remember where this passage was where Abraham got his name changed. I'll just give you the address in case you want to chase this down. Okay, so I'm actually, Genesis 16 is where we see about Sarai and her handmaid, and then Genesis 17 is where Abram's name gets changed to Abraham. Tell you what, since I'm in the neighborhood, I'm going to have a peek. Abram, exalted father. Abraham, father of a multitude. Or I think father of nations fits here. So I got it right. So we'll get out of here. Abraham's wife, Sarai, was barren for most of her life, but she's married to a man whose name is exalted father. And God has been promising Abram ever since Abram was 75 years old. God has been promising, I'm going to give you a son, and your son and his offspring are going to inherit the land of Canaan that you're standing on. This is going to be your land through your son and your son's offspring. Except Abraham doesn't have a son because Sarai is barren, and God is not letting her have children. So what to do? So Sarai has this brilliant idea. We'll take my servant Hagar, and Hagar will stand in for me, and I will have a child by Hagar. In other words, Abraham, you will have relations with Hagar, and her son will count as my son. Well, Hagar took pride in the fact that she was able to bear a son, and Sarah was not. That was a real sticking point. It created a lot of trouble in that family. Another example why you don't want polygamy in your marital relations. So there's this culture that seems to show up a time or two where a servant, a handmaid, can be a wife to her master in place of his primary wife, I'm guessing. There's a lot I don't know about the culture. So if you're familiar with Old Testament Judaism, if you have knowledge of how this works outside of the context of the Bible, then I'd be very interested to hear. So, but my understanding is these women who are married to their husbands and are giving their servants to their husband see the child of their servant as being their own child. If you're barren, then in this culture, you might consider your servant being a stand-in for you if you're a woman who wants to have a child. That was the way they see it. I do not see God endorsing this relationship where the servant is a surrogate mother and her mistress gets to claim the rights to that child. I don't see that endorsed anywhere in the Bible. You can say, but God's making laws about how to treat another wife. So there apparently is, God is taking care that even in these polygamous marriages, the second wife is getting taken care of, is being treated properly. We see that in the law of Israel. And again, as I was talking with a friend, I wonder if having polygamy in the culture, I'm not sure I expressed this well earlier, if having polygamy in the culture was a thing that had to be allowed because of the hardness of men's hearts. Just like divorce was. These seem to be related in that these seem to be a way that people can marry multiple people within one lifetime. The Bible does say that when someone dies, then their spouse is free of the marriage contract and can well marry someone else without being at fault for that. But we also see that God clearly, overtly, I'm trying to work around my my microphone here, and I'm not sure how well you can see my hands anyway, but God clearly, overtly says he hates divorce. And that's in the prophets. I'm not sure which one. I think it's one of the ones that starts with M. But God is clear that he hates divorce. And we see that he promotes monogamy. I think that is the way that he would prefer things be. And yet he had this room in the Israeli culture regarding polygamy. And I'm not sure if this is the answer. I think it's a fair one, that there are... It's hard to explain coming from a American position and coming from a position that does not promote polygamy. In our culture, women are very free to be autonomous. Women are very empowered. And for instance, we can hold a job. We can choose to say that we don't need a man. I think that overlooks the woman's special creative ability to be able to bear a child. I think God gave us that responsibility. It grieves me that a lot of the populations in the earth are not replacing themselves. And I understand for some other people that may be joyous because you may be concerned about the ecology. I don't see that of as great a concern as the people made in God's image who are not being born. And for various reasons not being born. And but we women are in a position where if we were to choose to leave our father's house and go live by ourselves and have our own job and not hook up with a man, not have any kind of relationship with a man, not get married, then we'd probably be okay. And that is a privilege of the modern day. I think things were different in the time of the Bible with a more agrarian culture where farming, this is redundant, agrarian culture, farming is very central to life. In an agrarian culture, you need to have people raising food from the ground. If you're not able to farm your own food, then you're going to get it from the market, and that food is going to be farmed by a farmer. And there are, from what I understand, fill me in if I'm wrong, there aren't a lot of job opportunities outside of that. Maybe there are some. Jesus was the son of a carpenter. One of his disciples was Matthew, the tax collector. You had your Roman soldiers or whatever. But society thrives on the back of the farmers, is what I understand. And a family like, say, Abraham's family, Isaac, it's clear that he raised crops. Jacob went to work for a man who had sheep. These are all agricultural, farming industries, and you were in a good position if you had your own animals and your own crops so that you could feed yourself. But for a woman, it's going to be harder to maintain that because women are naturally weaker physically than men are. For a woman, it's going to be harder to manage a farm. And also, I think for the people of Jacob's and Leah's time, as we're going to see in the passage we're looking at, I think childbearing was very important to them compared to where we are now. So that put those are just some of the factors that put women in a unique place where they would be at a disadvantage if they were on their own. I don't know that that necessarily makes polygamy necessary, but that's one of the things that I've been turning in my head for why would God allow some of the things that in American culture we recognize are negatives? Again, I don't think God endorsed polygamy, but I also see that there are laws that that express how a man was supposed to treat the wives under his roof equally, which is not a problem if you're monogamous, right? So that's just something that I've been thinking through, turning over in my mind. And it's something I want to be cautious about. I want to look at the Bible in the terms of the culture that I'm looking at. I don't think the cultures that are described in the Bible are always right. I think there are plenty of times in the Bible where the culture described in the Bible is clearly wrong. So let's get a little deeper into this so we can stop theorizing about what's wrong with polygamy and actually look at an example here. So we have Jacob. He finally gets Rachel, is willing to serve for another 7 years. And so Jacob went into Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah and served Laban for another 7 years. Now we get into Jacob's children. And let me go ahead and say, Jacob's children, he had 12 sons by the end of his life. We're going to look at the births of 11 of them. These 12 sons became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, which bore their names on into the future. So whenever anyone's talking about the 12 tribes of Israel, if they're throwing out the names of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, those are the names that we're going to be talking about here, except for the last tribe. Benjamin comes along later. So when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So I think this verse that we're kind of opening with is especially interesting. God is taking notice of the woman of the family. And I think naturally we're looking at what would be called a patriarchal society, where we're seeing women treated in a way that I think our culture rightly sees as disrespectful, where it is not one man and one wife where he is taking care of her and cherishing her. It is one man and as many wives as he can contain under his household, given his means. And that I think is demeaning of the woman. I don't think that, like I say, I don't think that's the ideal situation for a family. So we've got this situation. Jacob has these 2 wives, and naturally he's preferring one, Rachel, the one he always wanted, instead of the one that was foisted on him by her father. By the way, earlier, Laban made a comment when Jacob was saying he wanted to serve 7 years for Rachel. Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. Stay with him, serve the 7 years, get Rachel." So I'm guessing that the reason he pulled the switcheroo and had Leah marry Jacob, maybe in addition to the cultural, the firstborn's got to be married first. But why Jacob? He already thought that Jacob was a better pick than any other man who was available for Rachel. So naturally, Jacob would be better than any other man in terms of who Leah would marry, is my guess about why Laban would pull this deception. Interestingly, the whole reason that Jacob is at Laban's house is because Jacob pulled a deception. Jacob pulled a switcheroo, standing in place of Esau when Isaac was giving the blessing that changed the course of history. Essentially, Jacob became the ruler over Esau, and that had repercussions in the offspring of Jacob and in the offspring of Esau, who became the Edomites or the Idumeans, if you look at history later on. And now Jacob is dealing with the repercussions of I think this is a kind of God's poetic justice, or ironic justice, that Jacob is himself deceived and has to deal with these consequences. But the Lord saw that Leah was hated, and I think that's a strong word there. She is definitely not loved as much as Rachel, probably a little despised, because Jacob really didn't want her in the first place. So we look at hated and we think of someone maybe wants to kill someone else. I think the word hated gets used in the Bible in a lot of contexts that we wouldn't consider it. But definitely you do not want to be a wife who's despised by your husband either. And you may use the words hated. My husband hates me, if you were in Leah's position. So I think when we are looking at the Bible from our own cultural perspective, it's possible that we misread it because we're reading in our own version of the word hated here. And we've got to be open about what the Bible is saying in terms of the culture that it came from. And in this case, the Bible was written in Hebrew. That said, I also don't want to be tamping this down so much that I'm missing the meaning of this word here also. So Lord saw that Leah was hated. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Rachel is getting all of the attention from Jacob, and God is having grace for Leah, seeing that she is essentially unloved, and so he's giving her the blessing of being able to bear children. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. And one of the nice things about the English Standard Version is they have these footnotes. This one will tell us the meaning of Reuben means see, a son. So, husband, Jacob, please notice, I've got a son for you. Now you'll love me, right? Because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Simeon sounds like Hebrew for heard. And by the way, these footnotes, you may find them in the Bible text. If you pick up a paper Bible, you may find footnotes in your paper Bible. I just want to make it clear that the verses, as in the actual text in the verses, is what we Christians consider to be inspired by God and inerrant. The way that the verses are divided, for instance, that this one is in Genesis 29:33. Let's see, got a pop-up. I don't think you can see that on the screen, but dealt with it. The fact that this is in chapter 29 and verse 33, that is added in by man, not necessarily inspired by God. The footnotes are added in later by man, not necessarily inspired by God. So just so that you have an understanding as we're going through these, because we'll see a lot of footnotes regarding the names of these sons. But Leah, she keeps hoping. She's got her firstborn son, and she says, now maybe I'll be worthy of love. Maybe Jacob will love me now. Nuh-uh. She has a second son, and maybe because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. Maybe this will fix it. Maybe this will fix that I am hated. And she called his name Simeon. Sounds like Hebrew for heard. Again, she conceived and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. Sounds like Hebrew for attached. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. So she's done a good job. She's come up with 4 sons. That is more than Sarah had. That is more than Rebecca had. So Leah is definitely, if those wives were loved on the basis of their sons, and I know definitely Sarah was loved even before she had a son, even while she was barren. I think it was only because Sarah gave Abraham the okay to have relations with her servant that Abraham felt okay to have another wife. Abraham went a long time with his barren wife Sarah, not choosing another wife, up until she said, hey, you can go ahead and have a son by my servant. We'll call him my son. So it didn't take a son for Sarah to be loved. It didn't take 4 sons for Rebecca to be loved, but Leah sees all of her value coming from her children. And I think that's very sad. And yet the Lord, even before she bears sons, she's unloved by Jacob and sees no value in herself. And yet the Lord sees value in her and is giving her this desire that she has to bear children. It speaks to me that when she sees no value in herself, when her husband sees no value in her, God is essentially saying there is value in you. And for that reason, he is giving her this favor of allowing her to bear children, one that her sister Rachel does not have. But that should be okay because Rachel is loved by Jacob, right? So Rachel should be content with her relationship with her beloved husband. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" So neither of these folks are talking very nice to one another. Then she said, "Here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf." And the original Hebrew here is may give birth on my knees, essentially. So in my place, that even I may have children. Be built up, which sounds like the Hebrew for children. That even I may have children through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. So again, culturally, I don't know how Bilhah felt about this. I don't know how Hagar felt about being the surrogate for Sarah. And I don't. Nowadays, I think the word surrogate has its own meaning. So maybe it's not one that I should use here. I'm meaning the stand-in for Sarah, the one who would give birth for the son that would be credited to Sarah, even though I think the Bible is pretty clear that Ishmael was Hagar's son. It doesn't credit Ishmael to Sarah. Only Isaac gets the credit of being the son to Sarah, the way I understand the account to be written. In this case, Bilhah's children do seem to be credited to Rachel. We're going to see who those children are in a bit. So I don't know how it feels to be a servant and then suddenly find out, hey, you have to have a night with my husband so that I can have your son. To me, in an American context, that doesn't seem too great. I wouldn't be surprised if for a lot of servants that wasn't too great. I also wouldn't be surprised if for some servants, just a matter of society. If you're going to be a servant to someone who's being married, then you kind of understand you may wind up being married to her husband as well. That seems to be the way that things go here. Again, I don't believe that God endorses this because it would be polygamy. And from what I can tell in the Bible, I believe that monogamy is the way to go when it comes to sexual relations, especially monogamy within the umbrella of marriage. So in this case, Bilhah is being given as a wife to Jacob, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. So sounds like Hebrew for judged. I'm getting the feeling this son is not a punishment to Rachel, right? This is what she was looking for. So when she says God has judged me, I think what she's saying here is God has judged my case to be in the right. It's as if she is in court against her sister Leah, and God the judge has decided in her favor. So this name here for Dan kind of sounds a little bit contentious. The name, can you imagine being a child whose name gets to be determined based on the relations of your parents, and then maybe Reuben came out okay because his name means see a son, so that doesn't seem like a bad name to have. But then to be called Herd, and then to find out from the story that the Lord heard that she was hated and gave her a son, but then she still was unloved, and so then she called the next son attached, and that didn't really pan out, and then she called the next son praise, and then she ceased bearing. So I wonder what it was like for these sons. Their names actually seem pretty positive. Maybe they were okay, but then to be Dan, and your name means judged. And there's this sense of contention, I think, between Rachel, that Rachel is kind of stirring up. God has judged essentially in her favor, and has also heard my voice and given me a son. And again, here she is willing to die. I skipped over this part. I wanted to make this point. She is willing to die. Even though she has her husband's love and her sister does not, she is willing to die because she has no children. I can see the feeling behind that. I think, especially in this ancient Semitic society, where it was very important for a woman to bear children. I can see how important that would be. But it just feels bad to me that Rachel is not recognizing that she's actually got value. She's in a better position to recognize it than her sister with her husband Jacob's love that Leah is not experiencing, and yet even she is not seeing her own value. She believes she has no value unless she can have children. So she gives her servant to her husband. They're not even her children, but she gets to call this son's name judged. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. And this one says, you could translate the Hebrew with wrestlings of God. Mighty wrestlings could be ascribing God fighting on her behalf. With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. Sounds like Hebrew for wrestling. So definitely this name is contentious. Can you imagine being a kid whose name means wrestling? And hearing the story of why you have your name, because your mother was wrestling with her sister, because your parents had a sibling rivalry. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Sounds like Hebrew for good fortune. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. So honestly, I kind of like Leah in this case a little bit better than Rachel. I think Leah's the keeper in this situation. Not that there's anything wrong with Rachel, but I'm seeing Rachel stirring this pot of contention and not realizing that Leah is not getting the benefit of the love of their husband, not seeing the good that Rachel herself is experiencing. I can definitely empathize with Leah's position, and I am not seeing Leah in these names necessarily choosing to be contentious. To me, Rachel is the more contentious sister. Now, maybe I'm an older child, by the way. I'm an older sibling, so maybe that's another reason that I kind of relate to Leah. Maybe if you're a younger sibling, you can tell me what the younger sibling's perspective might have been in Rachel's case. I'd love to hear that down in the comments. So Leah has now, she's born 4 children, and her servant has born 2 children. Interesting, Rachel had, with Naphtali, said that she had prevailed when it was her servant who had born 2 children. So to me, Rachel just seems all mixed up. Because if your worth comes from the love of your husband, which is what Leah believes, which she believes that she can get through having sons, then Rachel already had that worth, right? But if your worth comes from having children, which is what Rachel believes, Rachel doesn't have her own children. She has 2 children by her servant. Leah has 4 children, by this point that Naphtali is born. And yet Rachel says that she prevails, maybe because she's both got the love of her husband and some children by her servant. And then Leah plays this tit for tat. I don't know that it's necessary to then drag the servant into this. I think that's biased towards my culture. I think that's not great. But definitely being raised in this culture, I can see why Leah would see nothing wrong with it. She has good fortune and happy are her children. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. I've been looking around at this word mandrakes. The word for, I know that for a lot of people of my generation and younger, this word mandrakes sure gives us thoughts of Harry Potter, and we might have a certain idea about what those plants were like. The word in Hebrew for mandrake, dudai, is from a root word that means pot, kettle, cauldron, basket. So, was a pot plant. I realized what I said afterward. It was a kettle plant, we'll say. It had a different effect than maybe what I unintentionally said. So the translators seem to pick out this mandrake plant. Apparently, there are a few different plants that this could have been. I just was kind of browsing through everything that looked like an article in my resources here. In defining this plant, interpreters have differed exceedingly. There's even a loofah, like I think this is the sponge-like plant that you may find in Bed Bath and Beyond sometimes. That's one of the possibilities for what this plant could be, but definitely the only times we see this word used in the Bible, these verses here are from the account we're about to read about Reuben's mandrakes. And then we have this verse from Song of Solomon. There's not a lot of verses here. Song of Solomon is a book in the middle of the Bible that is it's a love letter, essentially a love story. A lot of innuendo, a lot of sensuous imagery, and it's talking about, there's a phrase that keeps running through Song of Solomon, do not awaken love before its time. So interesting that there's this imagery, sorry about that, there's this imagery in Song of Solomon that is very provoking, and yet there's this running theme not to awaken love before its time. And so that indicates to me I'm trying to see if I can get an example of this phrase. I know that it shows up early in the book. Let's see. This is a bit of an aside, and if I don't see it quickly, I'll probably head back to whence I came. Okay. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases, according to the ESV version of that translation. So sometimes the wording is a little different between translations. So we'll go back to where we were. But I believe that Song of Solomon is written about a relationship between a man and his wife. So that makes it make more sense in the context of the Bible, where relations outside of marriage are not, sexual relations outside of marriage are not endorsed at all. Could cost you your life if you were already married or betrothed and you were fooling around with someone else. If you were not married or betrothed, you had to marry the person with whom you were fooling around. So the imagery here, I believe, would be between a man and a wife, but is definitely sexual in context. So we have we have two sections, one about these women who are bearing children for their husband, and then another, a romantic book of the Bible where the plant is used in a sexual context. So I think that gives us an idea about the significance of these mandrakes that Reuben's dug up. And then we have one more verse here. I think this word baskets is the one that is translated from Durai. Figs is a different word because I was thinking maybe it would be figs. So this one doesn't seem to be related to the context that we're talking about. So go back to where we were. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. And by the way, I believe this is all within the 7-year period that Jacob is working to pay for his marriage to Rachel. So Reuben would have been under 7 years old. Old enough to walk into, to do his own thing, but just barely old enough to dig up the ground, I imagine. Found these mandrakes, brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes," which, given what mandrakes represent, that's pretty significant. But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And I think if I were Rachel, I would probably be saying he was going to be my husband first, and then you stepped in. But she doesn't make that argument. Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." So they're negotiating here. Goes to show a downside to having these two wives directly. When Jacob came out from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. So the consequences that I'm talking about are he is clearly not free to use his time as he might have chosen. Due to his wife's bickering, the consequences of their fighting is trickling over to him. He's got a angry Rachel expecting him to give her what only God can give. He's got Leah commanding his time. So these seem like things you could avoid if you stick to a single wife at a time. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. So I wanted to point something out. In the previous chapter, going back here to when Leah had a son, her first son, Reuben, the Lord saw that Leah was hated. He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren and Leah conceived. So it's clear that Leah is having her children because the Lord is blessing her. This is the Lord's doing. When Rachel gives her servant to Jacob, it doesn't say anything about the Lord. It says, "And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son." Rachel is ascribing the birth to God, and certainly Bilhah could not have conceived a child without God's help. We see that in the Bible in other places. God allows everything to occur that does occur, but he is not directly credited with Bilhah's sons. Then Leah gives Zilpah, by the way, also with Naphtali. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceives. Again, not a word about God being involved in that birth. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she gave Zilpah to Jacob, and she bore a son. And she bore another son. And nothing is said about God assisting, helping the birth of these sons. However, when Leah then has her son, her 5th son, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Excuse me. So this seems clear that God is active in these births. So I don't know how much you can read into that. I kind of appreciate coming from the background that I do, where I don't really like the fact that these servant women are being appropriated for this task. I appreciate that I'm seeing God supporting the wives directly, Leah, and we're going to see Rebecca directly. And it doesn't seem like the servants quite have the same endorsement, I'm going to say, based on scripture here. So God listened to Leah, and her fifth son, Leah, said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she clearly disagrees with me. She thinks God does endorse the servants. I think it's interesting that she thinks the son that she is physically bearing has something to do with the servant that she gave to her husband before. So she called his name Issachar, sounds like Hebrew for wages or hire. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Sixth is a hard word to say, sixth. And then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun, sounds like Hebrew for honor. Unfortunately, that does not seem to have borne out. Afterward, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. The gals in the Bible often don't get even this much attention. I forgot to mention that we were talking about Jacob's 11 sons, excluding Benjamin, who comes later, and his daughter by Leah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, May the Lord add to me another son. Joseph says, may he add, and sounds like the Hebrew for taken away. So I wonder which one is the actual intention. Maybe both, since she said both God has taken away and may the Lord add to me another son. Again, I just kind of feel like Rachel's missing the point where she was satisfied with having 2 sons by a servant compared to Leah giving birth to 4 sons personally by that point. And yet she's not satisfied with her husband's love. Apparently now the 2 sons are not enough. And now even having her own son is not enough. She needs another son. So, Rachel's a woman. Nobody's perfect. And definitely Leah has her share of trouble too. I don't care for Rachel's attitude, but I can't say that if I were in her shoes, I would be any better behaved. But definitely I have my preference between the 2 gals, and it's not the one who is ungrateful for getting the good things in the marriage. So let me go ahead and wrap up there. That was where we were going to end. That was a toughie, dealing with the cultural differences between where I come from and ancient pre-Israeli culture. The name Israel hasn't even yet been given to the person for whom the nation is named. That is probably not far into the future, but it'll be a few weeks in this series. And it's a good thing that I am not judge, because I am sure that there may be things that I'm not understanding about these cultural situations that I ought to, maybe I would be a bit more balanced about my position. Maybe I wouldn't play favorites quite so much if I understood how things were going. One thing that I especially wanted to point out, I hope I've kind of given indications of it here, but I'll go ahead and call it out here at the very end. When we first start this story, I'm managing something on my desk here. When we first start this story, we start with Leah not receiving the love of her husband and seeking validation in the children she's bearing. And once she starts bearing, then Rachel gets jealous and doesn't appreciate the love of her husband, which she does have. She feels like she doesn't have value unless she can bear children. And even the fact that her servant is bearing children is only moderately soothing to her. It's not until she bears her own child that she says, now the Lord has taken away my reproach. And then on the heels of that, she says, may he add to me another son. So, I'm torn, because on the one hand, ideally Rachel would be just as healthy and just as able to bear children as Leah would in a perfect world. Clearly our world is not perfect. It's broken with the effects of sin, as we saw early on in the series in Genesis. Um, I expect some maturity that maybe wasn't there. But what I do see is that even though these two women can't find their own value, Leah can't find her value unless her husband loves her, and the more children she has, maybe the more value she'll have. No, that's not the case. He still doesn't love her as much as Rachel. God values her. God is behind her. God is supporting her, allowing her to bear these children, giving her hope. And then when Rachel can't find her own value, doesn't see it in the love of her husband, feels like it's missing because she can't bear children, then God still finds value even in Rachel, even in the one that I am least attached to at this point. He sees her value and he gives her the ability to bear a son. And then later on, he does add another son to her. So I am, I just wanted to point out God's love. I've been hearing lately about the Old Testament. People say the Old Testament is a book with an evil God. He's authoritarian. He's always judging people for what they do against him, and he's vindictive. And we really like the God of the New Testament better. The God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are the same God. You're going to find a lot of judgment in the New Testament, especially in the book of Revelation. That is especially where it comes up. And I'm seeing a lot of mercy in the Old Testament. I look at the account of Noah, the global flood, and God held out. God was patient with the world as it was becoming increasingly wicked until there was only one family left that was not completely inundated with wickedness. Every thought of every man's heart was wicked. And Noah was the standout in that case. And if Noah had not been preserved, then the entire world would have become too wicked, and God would have had to judge it eventually. So it is, I'm grateful that I'm here because Noah was allowed to survive despite God's judgment of the earth. So I think that the Noahic account with the global flood, the Great Deluge, as some people call it, is actually very merciful, and I am a beneficiary of that mercy. Later on, the account of Sodom and Gomorrah, God holds out, even though Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around there had a reputation for years and years and years of being wicked. At least, I think, 13 years, at least the time that Abraham was in the region. But God held on and didn't quite judge those cities. I don't know if the attack of the 5 kings counted as anything, but Abraham defeated those 5 kings. So that was an act of mercy on God's behalf, if that was any element of judgment. And then it's not until Lot and his family are just about corrupted. Basically, when you see the angels come, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah show themselves for what they are, and the angels strike them blind, and then they turn around to Lot and his family and say, "Get out of this city, everybody who is attached to you. Do you have sons? Do you have anyone who's attached to you?" So Lot tries to rescue his sons-in-law. They won't come. And then it's evening. And then morning comes up, and by that time, Lot's had some time to calm down, and had some time for the events of the previous night, the supernatural events where everybody was struck blind. That's kind of settled. And by the time the angels are sending him out of the city, he's going to, "I really have to go," which shows the level of corruption that he's experienced too, that he would rather stay in the city than save his life. The angels have to drag him and his family out of the city. Merciful, because Lot and his family, in the grand scheme of things, Lot's existence, I think, does more harm than good in history. And maybe I'm being, maybe there's something I'm missing here. But after Lot is rescued from the city, his daughters show how corrupted they were by the city. They, I'm going to say, abuse him sexually, and have sons who wind up the leaders of nations that are very much enemies of Israel. And from, I think from the position of Israel looking out, it would have been better if Lot and his daughters had not survived the city. But from the position of God looking in, Lot and his daughters were very important. God tried to rescue Lot's wife too. It's very famous what happened to her. She turned around just about ready to escape the city, wanted to go back, got turned into a pillar of salt just for turning around and looking. They were that close to getting judged. I think if Lot had turned around, he would have been turned into a pillar of salt as well if his daughters had turned around. So it was merciful that God put up with the city for the sake of the people within it, even as they were being slowly corrupted, and then rescued them even though they were corrupted, and even though in the long run that would do more harm than good. So I wish I'd thought to mention those details when I was actually talking about the birth of, I think, Moab, and if I'm not mistaken, Amnon. Maybe there's a different pronunciation. Maybe it's a different name. So forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that and using some other Semitic name. And here, even in a case that doesn't involve judgment, I see God's mercy and his concern for two ladies who, from a heaven level view, we say a 35,000 feet view, heaven so much higher than that, looking down all of these little ants on the surface of the earth. And there's these two little ants bickering over who gets to have the love of the husband. And God says, I love you both. And I'm going to give you the desires of your heart because I love you both. And I see the value in you both, even though you don't see the value in yourselves. And that actually is a benefit to all of us in long term in history. It established the nation of Israel. We have just seen the births of 11 out of the 12 tribes. That would be the tribes of Israel. And one of those tribes, the tribe of Judah, the fourth born child of Leah, is the tribe out of which the deliverer is going to come. So at the end of Genesis, we'll see where God starts to point out that Judah is the beginning of the line of the deliverer. We've been waiting for this deliverer since Genesis chapter 3, when God promised that the offspring of the woman Eve would bruise or crush the serpent's head. Even though the serpent would bruise or crush the deliverer's heel. I would rather have my heel crushed than my head crushed, personally. So we know who wins that battle. And we're at this point in the story, we're still looking for where that deliverer is going to come from. We need one person who is sinless, so he does not earn the effects of sin, death, upon himself, and is then free to take the punishment for sin on behalf of the rest of the world. So we're looking for that deliverer, and it is because of these 11, soon to be 12 sons that we have the benefit of that deliverer. So glad they're born. And that's it. I'll call it a night. I'll call it a video. And God bless you.